Sheriff Mark Dalton had lived his entire life in the same small town, tucked between long stretches of farmland and quiet country roads. Everyone knew everyone, and most people liked to keep things the way they had always been. The pace of life was slow, steady, and predictable. To outsiders, the town seemed peaceful, almost charming. But beneath the calm surface were old habits and old ways of thinking that no one talked about out loud. Mark had worked in law enforcement for more than 20 years. He started as a young deputy who believed in fairness and keeping people safe. But as time passed, he learned that the job wasn't always that simple. He had seen arguments, family troubles, petty crimes, and sometimes worse. Over time, the uniform and badge became part of him. People respected him, even feared him a little. Around town, when folks mentioned the sheriff, they said it with a mix of admiration and caution. He took pride in his work. He believed that keeping order meant keeping control. That was how he ran his department, firm by the book and loyal to his men. He often said that a sheriff was only as good as his team, and he trusted his deputies more than anyone else. Most of them had grown up together, gone to the same schools, and attended the same church. They shared meals, stories, and laughs. To him, they were more like brothers than co-workers. What he didn't see, what he never really looked for, was the prejudice that sat quietly among some of them. Mark's home life was very different from his work life. His wife Laura had passed away when their daughter Emily was just a little girl. Raising Emily on his own softened him in ways that surprised even him. Emily had her mother's gentle heart and her father's strong will. She loved animals, helped her classmates, and was the kind of person who smiled at strangers. Wherever she went, she made people feel lighter. Emily was 17 now, finishing her last year of high school. She dreamed of going to college in a big city, maybe becoming a nurse or a teacher, something that made a difference. Mark was proud of her, but also scared of the world beyond their town. He didn't say it, but part of him didn't want her to leave. The thought of that house without her laughter or music playing in the background was something he couldn't imagine. Every morning, their routine was the same. Mark would wake up before sunrise, drink his black coffee while reading the local newspaper, and listen to the sound of Emily getting ready upstairs. She'd come down with her hair still damp, grab her backpack, and tease him for being too serious. "You know, Dad," she would say with a grin, "you should try smiling before noon one day. Might do you some good." He would grumble, pretend to be annoyed, and then drive her to school anyway, even though she could easily walk. It was their quiet time together, those short drives. He'd ask about her classes, and she'd ask about his day. And even though they came from different worlds, his filled with rules, hers with dreams, they understood each other completely. At the station, life followed its rhythm. The deputies liked to joke, drink bad coffee, and tell stories about traffic stops or local troublemakers. Most of them respected the sheriff deeply, though some felt he was too strict. They knew his expectations: loyalty, obedience, and no drama that could make the department look bad. Among them were Deputies Collins and Rayner, both longtime members of the force. They had served under Mark for years and often talked about the good old days when, as they put it, people knew their place. Mark didn't always like their tone, but he brushed it off as harmless talk. He told himself that as long as they did their jobs and followed orders, it wasn't his business how they spoke off duty. The town itself was small but growing. A new hospital had opened a few miles away, bringing in younger doctors and nurses from different parts of the country. Some townsfolk were welcoming, others less so. When a new trauma surgeon named Dr. Malik Harris joined the hospital staff, there were whispers. He was young, highly skilled, and confident, but what some couldn't overlook was that he wasn't from around there, and he wasn't white. Mark had met him briefly during a community safety meeting. Dr. Harris had a calm, professional way about him, and he spoke passionately about improving emergency response times in rural areas. Mark respected that, though he didn't give it much thought afterward. He had too much on his plate already. Emily had been busy that week preparing for her school's annual charity event. She and her friends had been collecting donations for a children's hospital and organizing a small fair to raise funds. That Friday she came home late, tired but excited. "Dad, we raised almost $1,000, she said proudly, tossing her bag on the couch. Mark smiled from behind his newspaper. "That's impressive, kiddo. You really did it." After dinner, Emily sat at the kitchen table working on a school essay about community and compassion. She asked her father what justice meant to him. He thought for a moment before answering. "Justice," he said slowly, "is doing what's right, even when it's hard." She nodded, writing down his words, not knowing how much those same words would echo in his heart later on. That night, as the house grew quiet, Mark walked past her room and saw her asleep over her books. He turned off the lamp, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." The next morning, Saturday, began like any other. The sun rose over the fields, casting a golden glow across the town. Mark was at the station early, reviewing reports. Emily had plans to meet her friends at the lake outside of town. She waved goodbye from her car, promising to be back by dinner. For most of the day, everything seemed fine. The radio at the station crackled with routine calls. Speeding tickets, noise complaints, nothing serious. Around late afternoon, clouds began to gather. A storm was brewing in the distance, but Mark barely noticed. He was busy signing off reports when the phone rang. It was one of the highway patrol officers, his voice tense. "Sheriff, there's been an accident on County Road 14. Single vehicle, young female driver, severe injuries." Mark felt a chill rush through him. County Road 14. That was the same route Emily took to the lake. His heart pounded as he grabbed his keys and ran for his truck. The world around him blurred. Every second felt like an eternity. He didn't know yet what had happened, but deep down he feared the truth. The small town that had always felt so safe suddenly seemed enormous and empty. The road stretched endlessly before him, and the storm clouds darkened the sky. As he sped toward the flashing lights in the distance, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily's smile that morning, the way she had waved from the driveway. He whispered a prayer under his breath, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Behind him, the town carried on as usual, people shopping, chatting, laughing, unaware that in a few short hours, everything was about to change for the man they all thought was unshakable. And as he approached the scene, the sound of sirens mixed with the low rumble of thunder, marking the beginning of a night that would test everything he believed in: his duty, his faith, and his own heart. It was the day that would take from him the one person he loved most, and the truth of what really happened would soon shatter not only his world, but the entire town's quiet illusion of fairness and decency. That was the day when the sheriff, the man everyone thought had all the answers, would come face to face with the hidden darkness inside the people he trusted most. It had been raining lightly for hours when Sheriff Mark Dalton reached the crash site. The road curved sharply near a wooded patch where the pavement often turned slick after a storm. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. His tires screeched to a stop on the wet gravel, and he jumped out before the truck had even settled. The sound of rushing water in the nearby ditch mixed with radio chatter and the low murmur of paramedics calling out instructions. Mark's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He saw the mangled silver car resting halfway in the ditch, the front smashed in from the impact with a tree. For a moment he couldn't move. He already knew it was her car, the little charm she had tied to the rearview mirror, a tiny sun-shaped pendant she'd made in art class, swung in the light from the emergency vehicles. His throat tightened. He forced himself forward, his boots splashing in the mud. "Where is she?" he shouted. The medics turned. One of them, a young man with trembling hands, pointed toward the ambulance. "We've got her inside, Sheriff. She's alive, but it's bad." Mark climbed inside the ambulance, his breath catching as he saw her. Emily was lying on the stretcher, her face pale, her hair damp from the rain and blood. She was barely conscious. Tubes, wires, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. He took her hand. It felt cold and small. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice shaking. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. "Dad?" she whispered. "I'm right here. You're gonna be okay," he said, trying to sound steady, even though his chest felt like it was collapsing. One of the paramedics spoke quickly to him. "We need to get her to the hospital as soon as possible. Internal bleeding. We've called for the trauma surgeon. Dr. Harris is on his way." Mark nodded without thinking. He knew who that was. The new doctor from the city. People had said he was one of the best. That was all that mattered to Mark now. Nothing else. The rain came down harder, pounding on the roof of the ambulance. The wipers on the paramedics' truck squealed as they moved back and forth, trying to clear the windshield. Mark climbed back out, pacing near the flashing lights. He looked toward the end of the road where a checkpoint had been set up to manage traffic. Two of his deputies were standing there, Collins and Rayner. They waved cars back, telling onlookers to move along. "Any sign of the doctor?" Mark shouted. Collins shrugged. "He should have been here by now, Sheriff. Probably got lost or turned around." "Radio him." "I need him here now," Mark yelled. Collins nodded and spoke into his radio, but the reply came back faint, broken by static. The storm was messing with the signal. Mark felt a knot forming in his stomach. He went back to the ambulance, where the paramedics were preparing to move Emily. "We can't wait much longer," one of them said. "She needs surgery fast." Mark climbed in beside her again, holding her hand as the vehicle started down the narrow road toward the hospital. The ride felt endless. The sirens screamed through the night, the rain beating against the windshield. Every time Emily moaned softly in pain, he felt helpless. He kept talking to her, whispering that everything would be fine, that help was waiting at the hospital, even though a small voice inside him said otherwise. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Dr. Malik Harris was driving as fast as he could through the storm. His phone buzzed with messages from the hospital staff: an emergency, young female, internal injuries, possible head trauma. He'd been on call all night and was used to moving fast under pressure. His GPS showed the route to County Road 14, but as he approached the edge of town, he saw 2 patrol cars blocking the way. He slowed down and rolled down his window. Rain blew inside as he leaned out and called, "Dr. Harris, trauma surgeon? I'm heading to the accident scene." The deputies standing there, Collins and Rayner, exchanged a glance. One of them stepped closer, shining his flashlight into the car. "You got ID?" Dr. Harris held up his hospital badge. "Yes, I'm the surgeon on call. They said it was critical." The deputy didn't move. "We already got medics on the scene, Doc. We'll call you if we need you." Dr. Harris frowned, confused. "You don't understand. Every minute matters. If she's bleeding internally, she might not make it to the hospital. Let me through." But the deputies stayed put. "Protocol, sir. You can wait here." Dr. Harris felt frustration rising, but he tried to stay calm. "Please, I'm not here to argue. Someone's life is at stake. Let me through." The other deputy, Rayner, leaned against his car and shook his head. "We said we got it handled." The rain poured down harder, soaking Dr. Harris's sleeves as he leaned farther out. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly. "Move the cars." Collins folded his arms. "You're out of your jurisdiction here, Doc. We don't need outsiders interfering with an active police scene." "Outsiders?" Dr. Harris repeated quietly. He could feel his pulse racing. "I'm not an outsider. I'm a doctor trying to save someone's life, but they didn't move." The minutes dragged on, and each one felt heavier than the last. Back on the road, the ambulance sped toward the hospital, bouncing over potholes and curves. Inside, Emily's breathing had become shallow. "She's fading," one of the medics said. "We're losing her pressure." Mark held her hand tighter, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, baby, please." Didn't know that the man who could have given her the best chance, Dr. Harris, was being held back, just a few miles away by 2 of his own men. When the ambulance finally reached the hospital, nurses rushed them through the emergency doors. The doctor on duty, a general physician, took one look at Emily and shouted for the surgical team. They did everything they could, rushed scans, IV lines, oxygen, but time had already slipped away. Dr. Harris arrived 20 minutes later, his clothes still wet from the rain, his face pale with anger and disbelief. When he saw the sheriff standing in the waiting area, drenched and shaking, he walked straight toward him. "Sheriff Dalton," he said firmly, "I was stopped on the way here. Your men wouldn't let me through. They said it was protocol." Mark looked at him confused. "What? That can't be right. Why would they?" He stopped mid-sentence as realization hit him. The checkpoint, Collins, Rayner. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't make it, did she?" he whispered. Dr. Harris lowered his eyes. "We tried everything we could." The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of hospital machines. Mark felt his knees weaken. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. His world collapsed in that moment. For a long time he couldn't move. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his body numb. People passed by, nurses whispered, but all he could hear was the echo of Emily's voice, her laugh that morning, her last, "Dad?" in the ambulance. Hours later, as dawn broke over the horizon, the rain stopped. The storm clouds drifted away, leaving the streets washed clean, but nothing inside him felt clean anymore. His uniform was still damp, and his badge, once a symbol of pride, felt unbearably heavy on his chest. He walked outside into the cold morning air and looked up at the pale light creeping across the sky. The world kept turning as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. He didn't know yet how deep the betrayal went or what it would cost him to uncover it. All he knew was that somewhere between duty and love, between loyalty and truth, something had gone terribly wrong, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right. The hospital hallway was still and heavy with silence. Sheriff Mark Dalton sat in a plastic chair outside the emergency room, staring at the tiled floor. His clothes were damp from the rain and his hands trembled slightly. Hours had passed since the accident, yet he couldn't move. He couldn't think. Every sound, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the beep of distant machines felt far away, almost unreal. Emily was gone. His only child. His light. The nurse had spoken softly, her voice steady but kind. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. We did everything we could." He had nodded, unable to speak, unable to cry. The words meant nothing. Nothing could change what had happened. The world that had once made sense to him had fallen apart in a single night. After a while, Dr. Malik Harris approached him again. The doctor looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, scrubs wrinkled, hair still damp from the rain. He stood for a long moment before speaking. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something important." Mark didn't look up. He just kept staring at the floor. "Your deputies stopped me on my way to the accident," Dr. Harris continued. "They wouldn't let me pass even after I showed them my credentials and told them it was an emergency. They said they had things under control. I tried calling ahead, but the signal was weak because of the storm." Mark slowly lifted his head. "What are you saying?" "I was delayed for almost half an hour," Dr. Harris said carefully. "By the time I reached the hospital, she was already here. We lost precious time." Mark blinked, confused at first, then angry. "That can't be right. My men wouldn't stop a doctor during an emergency." Dr. Harris sighed. "Sheriff, I'm not here to argue. I just thought you should know. I understand grief makes everything harder, but I need you to look into this." He turned and walked away, leaving Mark alone with the weight of those words. For a long time, Mark sat there, trying to make sense of it. His deputies, his own men, had delayed the one person who could have saved Emily? No, that couldn't be true. They were loyal, trained, disciplined. There must have been a misunderstanding. But as the sun began to rise, doubt crept into his mind. He could see their faces in his memory, Collins and Rayner standing at that roadblock. He had yelled at them earlier, asked if they'd seen the doctor. Collins had just shrugged. By mid-morning, Mark forced himself to stand. He walked out of the hospital into the crisp morning air. The world outside felt too bright, too normal. People were going about their lives, unaware that his world had shattered. He drove straight to the station. The usual morning chatter stopped the moment he walked in. The deputies fell silent, sensing the grief that hung over him. Some lowered their heads. Others whispered quiet condolences. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His voice would have broken if he tried. Instead, he went straight into his office, closed the door, and sat at his desk. The chair creaked under his weight. The badge on his chest gleamed faintly in the light, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a symbol of honor. It felt like guilt. After a few minutes, he picked up the phone and called in Deputies Collins and Rayner. His tone was cold, sharp, the kind of voice that made people stand at attention. They entered nervously, hats in hand. Collins spoke first. "Sheriff, we're real sorry about what happened to your girl. If there's anything we can—" "Did you stop a doctor last night?" Mark interrupted. They glanced at each other. "What do you mean, sir?" "Don't play dumb with me," Mark snapped. "Dr. Harris said he was held up at a checkpoint near County Road 14. That was your post." "I want the truth." Rayner shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yeah, we stopped him. But we were following procedure. The road was closed off. We didn't know who he was at first." "You didn't know who he was?" Mark repeated slowly. "He showed you his ID, didn't he?" Collins nodded. "Sure, but you know how it is out there at night. Storm coming down, people claiming to be someone they're not. We were being careful." "Careful?" Mark's voice rose. "A girl was dying and you were being careful?" Neither man spoke. Collins cleared his throat, his tone defensive. "We didn't mean any harm, Sheriff. We just didn't think it was urgent. The paramedics were already there." Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Did you call it in? Did you tell dispatch a trauma doctor was trying to get through? Rayner looked down. We were gonna, but the signal was cutting out. Mark slammed his fist on the desk. The sound made both deputies flinch. You cost my daughter her life, he said quietly, each word shaking with anger. Do you understand that? She could have lived. And you stopped the man who might have saved her. Collins stammered. Sheriff, we didn't... Get out, Mark said through clenched teeth. Now. They hesitated, but one look at his face told them he meant it. They left without another word. The door shut behind them with a dull click. Mark sat there, shaking. He wanted to shout, to cry, to break something. But all he could do was sit and stare at the wall, his mind replaying the night over and over. Later that day, Dr. Harris came to the station. He looked calm, but his eyes showed the same exhaustion Mark felt. I didn't come to cause trouble, the doctor said quietly. But I filed a report with the hospital and the county. There has to be accountability. Mark nodded slowly. There will be, he said. His voice was hoarse. I promise you that. For the next few days, the town buzzed with whispers. Everyone knew about the accident. They brought food to Mark's house, offered prayers, and spoke in hushed tones when he walked by. But when word spread that his own deputies had stopped the doctor, the sympathy turned into curiosity and quiet judgment. People began to question things they had never questioned before. Some defended the sheriff's men, saying they were only doing their job. Others called it negligence. A few mentioned the unspoken truth everyone knew but rarely admitted, the prejudice that had lingered in the town for generations. Mark stayed mostly silent. He spent his days in his office going through reports, listening to radio recordings from that night and reviewing every detail. The more he listened, the heavier his heart grew. The timestamps confirmed it. The deputies had delayed the doctor for nearly 30 minutes. When the county investigator arrived, Mark handed over all the files himself. Do whatever you need to do, he said flatly. No one is above the law. Not even my men. The investigator nodded, surprised by the sheriff's bluntness. That night, when Mark returned home, the house felt emptier than ever. Emily's things were still everywhere. Her books, her jacket on the chair, her shoes by the door. He sat at the kitchen table where she used to study, staring at the half-finished school essay she'd left behind. The last line read, "Real justice means doing what's right even when it's hard." He ran his hand over the paper, his vision blurring. The phone rang suddenly, startling him. It was the mayor calling to check in. They spoke briefly, but Mark barely listened. He knew what the mayor wanted, to keep the situation quiet, to avoid bad publicity for the town. But Mark didn't care about reputation anymore. His daughter was dead. The truth was all that mattered now. After hanging up, he stood by the window looking out into the night. The town lights flickered in the distance, peaceful and unaware. He whispered to himself, I'll make it right, Emily, I swear I will. The following morning, he called for a department meeting. Every deputy gathered in the briefing room, their faces tense. Mark stood at the front, his uniform neat but his expression weary. What happened last week was a tragedy, he began, but it was made worse by a failure of duty and a failure of humanity. No one spoke. I built this department on trust, he continued. But trust means nothing without integrity. From this day forward, we follow the law, we follow our conscience, and we treat every person, no matter who they are, with respect. If anyone has a problem with that, there's the door. The room stayed silent. A few men shifted in their seats, uneasy. Collins and Rayner stared down at the table. Mark's voice softened. My daughter believed in fairness. She believed in people doing what's right. I won't let her memory be stained by ignorance. When the meeting ended, no one dared to speak. Mark went back to his office, closed the door, and sat alone once more. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be investigations, media attention, and maybe lawsuits. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth, and the quiet promise he had made to his daughter. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the small town. For the first time in his life, the sheriff felt the weight of everything he had ignored. The small jokes, the quiet biases, the things he brushed off as harmless. They weren't harmless. They had taken everything from him. He looked at Emily's photo on his desk and whispered, I see it now. And in that moment, he knew his life would never be the same again. The days after Emily's funeral moved slowly. as if time itself refused to pass. Sheriff Mark Dalton had never felt so empty. The house was too quiet, the air too still. Every corner reminded him of her. The jacket hanging by the door, the faint scent of her perfume on the couch, her photos smiling down from the walls. He would catch himself listening for her footsteps in the morning, expecting her to come down the stairs and tease him about his strong coffee or his serious face. But she never did. The funeral had been simple but filled with people. Friends, teachers, neighbors all came to pay their respects. The whole town seemed to feel the loss, though no one could truly understand the hollow pain in Mark's chest. Dr. Malik Harris had stood quietly in the back during the service, head bowed. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. His presence alone meant something. After everyone had gone home, Mark sat by Emily's grave long after sunset. The rain had started again, soft and steady, soaking through his jacket. He didn't move. He just stared at the small gravestone with her name carved neatly into it. He whispered her name again and again as if saying it enough times might bring her back. When he finally returned home, it was almost midnight. He poured himself a cup of coffee, even though he hadn't slept properly in days. The kitchen felt like a museum of memories, her unfinished painting on the counter, her half-used notebook near the window. He sat there in the dim light, gripping his mug, trying to make sense of the world again. The next morning, he went back to the station. Everyone grew silent when he walked in. Some offered quiet nods, others avoided his eyes. He looked different now, older, heavier somehow. His usual firm, commanding presence had been replaced by something quieter, deeper. He went straight into his office and began sorting through files. There were investigation papers, radio transcripts, and reports from the night of the crash. The official inquiry was already underway. The county investigators were reviewing everything: communication logs, dispatch calls, statements from the deputies involved. When they arrived to question him, Mark answered every question honestly. He didn't try to defend his men. He didn't try to shift the blame. "I trusted them," he said simply. "That was my mistake." Later that afternoon, Dr. Harris came by the station again. This time, Mark invited him into his office. They sat in silence for a few minutes before the doctor finally spoke. "I heard there's an internal investigation," he said quietly. Mark nodded. "There is. I asked for it myself. I won't let this be brushed aside." Dr. Harris sighed. "I appreciate that. But I've seen things like this before. They start strong, then fade away when people stop paying attention." Mark looked at him. "Not this time." The doctor studied his face and nodded slowly. "I believe you." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the faint hum of the building. For the first time since the accident, Mark felt a strange sense of calm. Talking to Dr. Harris didn't bring Emily back, but it reminded him of something she had believed in: fairness, compassion, doing what's right. Over the next few weeks, the story spread beyond their small town. A local reporter had caught wind of it, and soon the headline appeared online: "Sheriff's daughter dies after deputies delay doctor at accident scene." At first, Mark tried to ignore it. He didn't care about the news or what people were saying. But when reporters began showing up at the station, when cameras pointed at him as he walked to his truck, he realized he couldn't hide from it. The truth was out there now, and the whole world wanted answers. He gave one short statement to the press. "My daughter's death was not an accident. It was a failure of duty and humanity. I will cooperate fully with every investigation until justice is done." That one sentence was enough to send shockwaves through the community. Some people praised him for his honesty, saying it took courage to speak against his own department. Others criticized him, saying he was betraying his men and bringing shame to the badge. Old friends stopped calling. A few of his deputies grew distant. But Mark didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about reputation or power. He was thinking about what was right. One evening, he drove out to the hospital. The staff there greeted him with quiet sympathy. He went to Dr. Harris's office where the doctor was finishing up paperwork. "I wanted to thank you," Mark said. Dr. Harris looked surprised. "For what?" "For trying," Mark said simply. "You did what you could." "I know that now," the doctor nodded slowly. "I wish I could have done more." "So do I," Mark said softly. They stood there for a moment in silence. Then Mark added, "People in this town, they don't always see what's right in front of them. I was one of those people. I should have known better. I should have seen what was happening under my own command. Dr. Harris hesitated before replying. We can't change the past, Sheriff, but maybe we can make sure it doesn't happen again. That thought stayed with Mark for days. When he returned to the station, he began reviewing every personnel record, every complaint that had ever been filed. He wanted to know everything about the people wearing his department's badge. It was slow, painful work. Each report revealed something he had once overlooked. Small acts of disrespect, ignored warnings, words spoken behind closed doors. He realized how deep the problem went, how many times he had turned away rather than confront it. One evening, as he sat in his office surrounded by stacks of papers, Collins and Rayner knocked on his door. Come in, he said quietly. They entered looking uneasy. Collins spoke first. Sheriff, we wanted to apologize again. We didn't mean for any of this to happen. Mark looked up at them. His eyes were tired, but his voice was steady. You didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And you both knew better. Rayner swallowed hard. We were just following orders. You thought wrong, Mark interrupted. You thought your judgment mattered more than a dying person's life. You thought your own opinions were more important than your duty. Neither man spoke. Mark continued, his voice low but firm. You let your pride get in the way of compassion. That's not policing. That's arrogance. And it cost my daughter her life. He signed 2 papers on his desk and pushed them forward. You're both suspended without pay, effective immediately. The county will decide if you're ever allowed to wear a badge again. They left without a word. The door closed softly behind them, and Mark leaned back in his chair, exhausted but certain it was the right thing to do. In the days that followed, the tension in town grew. Some residents began protesting outside the station, holding signs that said things like, "Justice for Emily and no more hate in our town." Others stood on the opposite side of the street, shouting that the sheriff was turning against his own people. Through it all, Mark kept calm. He attended every meeting, answered every question, and never raised his voice. He wasn't interested in politics or reputation. He was interested in truth. At home, the loneliness still lingered, but it began to change shape. Instead of silence filled with pain, there was silence filled with purpose. He started writing again, letters to Emily that he never sent. In them, he told her about the steps he was taking, the changes he was making, and the promise he intended to keep. One night, he drove to the lake where she and her friends used to spend their weekends. The water was calm, the air still. He sat on the hood of his truck, staring at the reflection of the moon on the surface. He thought about all the times he had told her that being strong meant never showing weakness. How wrong he'd been. Strength wasn't about silence. It was about standing up when it mattered, even if it meant standing alone. He whispered into the night. You were right, kiddo. Justice means doing what's right, even when it's hard. The words carried softly across the water, fading into the quiet. By the time he drove home, he knew what he had to do next. He couldn't undo what happened, but he could make sure no one else suffered because of ignorance or pride. He drafted a new department policy that same night. Mandatory bias and compassion training, a public accountability board, and strict emergency response rules that left no room for personal judgment. Every deputy would be retrained, every complaint reviewed openly. It was just the beginning, but it was something. As dawn broke over the town, the first rays of sunlight touched the sheriff's badge on his desk. For the first time since that terrible night, Mark felt a small, fragile sense of peace. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. He whispered to himself, "This is for you, Emily." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the soft glow of morning light, he knew his fight for justice had only just begun. The following months changed everything in Sheriff Mark Dalton's life. The investigation into the deputy's actions had grown beyond the county. State officials got involved, and soon there were meetings, hearings, and interviews that filled his days. Every detail of the night Emily died was being reviewed, and every piece of information was questioned. Mark went through it all quietly. He answered every question, handed over every report, and never once tried to excuse anyone. He wasn't protecting anyone anymore, not his department, not his old friends, not even himself. The truth mattered more than his pride. The town that had once admired him now seemed divided. Some people thanked him for doing the right thing, while others whispered behind his back that he had turned against his own men. He heard the gossip at the diner, the grocery store, even at church. But he didn't argue. He'd learned that people only see what they want to see. He had stepped down from his position as sheriff a few weeks after the internal report was released. It wasn't forced, he chose to do it himself. He stood in front of his deputies that morning, wearing his uniform for the last time. "I spent most of my life believing that being a sheriff meant having control," he said quietly. "But I was wrong. It's not about control. It's about service. I failed to see what was happening right under my nose. My daughter paid the price for that." No one spoke. Even the toughest men in that room couldn't meet his eyes. He took off his badge, set it gently on the table, and walked out. From that day on, he lived a quieter life. He sold the house where he'd raised Emily and moved into a small cabin just outside town. The silence there was different, less heavy, more peaceful. Some nights he'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the stars and think about her. He'd imagine her voice, her laughter, the way she used to tease him for being too serious. There were still moments when grief hit him so hard he could barely breathe. But it wasn't the same kind of pain anymore. It wasn't anger or guilt. It was love that had nowhere to go. One afternoon, months later, he received a letter in the mail. It was from Dr. Malik Harris. "Sheriff Dalton, I thought you should know that the hospital has started a new program in your daughter's name. It will fund emergency response training for small towns like ours, so that what happened that night never happens again. I wanted to thank you for your honesty and for standing up when it mattered." People don't forget that kind of courage. Dr. M. Harrismark held the letter for a long time. For the first time in a while, he smiled. Not a big smile, but a quiet one that came from somewhere deep. Emily would have loved that idea. She had always wanted to help people. A few weeks later, the mayor called him unexpectedly. "Mark," he said, "the town council is hosting a community memorial next month. They're dedicating a section of the park to Emily. We'd like you to say a few words." Mark hesitated. He hadn't spoken publicly since the day he stepped down. He wasn't sure he could. But after a long pause, he agreed. The day of the memorial came bright and clear. The park was filled with families, children playing, and townspeople gathered near a new bench and a small plaque that read, "In memory of Emily Dalton, a light that reminds us to care." When Mark stepped up to the small podium, he felt his hands shake slightly. He looked out at the crowd. So many faces he knew, some he didn't. He spotted Dr. Harris standing quietly toward the back. That gave him strength. He began to speak in a low, steady voice. "Emily was my daughter, but she belonged to this town too. She grew up here. She loved this place, and she believed in its people. She believed that kindness could fix almost anything. I used to tell her that the world wasn't that simple, that rules mattered more than feelings. I was wrong." He took a deep breath. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying his words softly across the park. "She taught me that strength isn't about how loud you are or how much power you have. It's about how you treat people. She believed that real justice starts with compassion, and because of her, I see that now." He looked at the plaque for a moment. Her life may have been short, but her message will live on in every person who chooses to care instead of judge, to listen instead of assume. That's what she would have wanted. When he finished, the crowd stood silently for a few seconds before breaking into gentle applause. Some wiped their eyes. Others smiled softly. Mark stepped down from the podium and sat quietly on the bench that bore her name. Later that evening, after most people had gone, Dr. Harris walked up to him. "That was a beautiful speech," he said. "Thank you," Mark replied. "And thank you for what you're doing at the hospital." "Emily would have liked that." Dr. Harris smiled faintly. "We all lost something that night, Sheriff. But I think you've turned that loss into something meaningful." Mark nodded. "I hope so. I still have days when I wonder what she'd say if she could see all this." The doctor looked at the sky, where the first stars were starting to appear. "I think she'd say you finally learned what she was trying to teach you." Mark chuckled softly. "Yeah, maybe she did." As the months went by, the town began to change. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. The sheriff's department got new leadership. Someone younger, open-minded, eager to rebuild trust with the community. Training programs started, and people began to speak more openly about fairness, about treating others with respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Mark sometimes visited the new sheriff's office, offering quiet advice when asked. He never interfered, never tried to take control again. He just wanted to help. He still carried his old badge in his jacket pocket, a reminder of what he'd learned the hardest way possible. Every Sunday, he drove to the cemetery and sat by Emily's grave. He'd bring fresh flowers, sometimes wild daisies from the field behind his cabin. He'd talk to her softly, telling her about what was changing in town, the programs, the new officers, the way people were beginning to listen to one another again. "You did this," he would say. "You started something good." Sometimes he stayed there until sunset, watching the colors fade into the horizon. It became his ritual, his way of keeping her close. One evening, as he sat there, a young woman approached. She looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Sheriff Dalton?" "I used to be," he said with a small smile. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "My brother works at the hospital now. He told me about the new training program. He said it's saving lives already. That wouldn't have happened if you hadn't spoken up." Mark's eyes softened. "I didn't do much," he said. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do," she said quietly before walking away. He watched her leave, the wind tugging at her hair, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. The world was still flawed, still unfair in many ways, but it was moving forward, and that was enough. That night, he sat by the fireplace in his cabin, the flames flickering gently. On the mantel sat a small photo of Emily, taken when she was little, grinning with missing front teeth. Beside it was the letter from Dr. Harris, now framed. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I hope you're proud of me, kiddo." In the quiet of the cabin, he could almost hear her laugh, soft and warm, like she was still there. The next morning, he woke early, made himself coffee, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky clear. He watched the sun rise over the trees, lighting up the fields with golden light. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the start of another empty day. It felt like a new beginning. He had lost everything once, but in the ashes of that loss, he had found something greater: understanding, forgiveness, and a reason to keep going. The town would never be the same again, and neither would he. But maybe that was the point. Maybe change only came through pain, and healing only came through truth. As he walked down the path toward his truck, the wind carried the faint sound of bells from the town's church tower. He paused for a moment, smiled faintly, and whispered to himself, "We're okay now, Emily." Then he got in his truck, started the engine, and drove toward the town that was finally learning to heal, one honest step at a time. The morning air was cool and calm as the sun rose over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sheriff Mark Dalton, though he was no longer sheriff, stood on the porch of his small cabin, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The world around him was quiet except for the sound of birds greeting the new day. He took a deep breath, letting the peace sink in. It had been a long time since he'd felt that kind of stillness inside him. The town had changed a lot over the past year. The department had new officers, new leadership, and new training. There were still a few who resisted the change, still clinging to the old ways, but more and more people had begun to understand what fairness and compassion really meant. The tragedy that had taken Emily's life had shaken everyone, but it had also opened their eyes. Mark didn't go into town as often as he used to, but when he did, people treated him differently. Some offered gentle smiles or nods of respect. Others simply said, "We remember," and that was enough. He didn't need grand gestures or apologies. He just wanted people to learn something from what had happened. That morning, he got in his truck and drove into town. He stopped by the small bakery that Emily used to love. The owner, an older woman with silver hair, greeted him warmly. "It's been a while, Mark," she said. He smiled softly. "It has. Thought I'd stop by for one of those apple tarts she used to drag me here for." The woman chuckled and handed him a fresh one, still warm from the oven. "On the house," she said. He tried to refuse, but she waved him off. "It's for her," she said quietly. He sat at one of the small tables by the window, looking out at the main street. The town seemed busier than before. Kids running with backpacks, people chatting outside the hardware store, life moving on. For a moment, he felt Emily there beside him, laughing, teasing him about eating too slowly. He smiled and took another bite, closing his eyes to hold on to the memory. After breakfast, he drove to the community center, where a new event was taking place that day. It was called the Dalton Foundation for Compassion and Service, named not for him, But for Emily, it was Dr. Harris's idea. He had worked tirelessly to bring the community together for something meaningful. The foundation's purpose was simple: to fund medical and emergency training for rural communities, to ensure no one ever had to wait for help because of who they were. When Mark arrived, the parking lot was full. People were setting up tables, banners, and booths. He spotted Dr. Harris near the entrance, speaking with a group of young volunteers. When he saw Mark, his face lit up. "You made it," the doctor said warmly, shaking his hand. "I wouldn't miss it," Mark replied. "You've done good work here," Dr. Harris smiled. "We've done it together. You gave people the courage to talk about things they never used to. You showed them that real change is possible." Mark looked around at the crowd, at the mix of faces, different races, backgrounds, ages, all working side by side. "Maybe we both just reminded them what it means to care," he said quietly. As the event began, Mark walked through the booths, listening to the laughter, the conversations, the sound of children running across the grass. It felt alive, hopeful. He stopped near a mural being painted on one of the walls. It showed a scene of unity: doctors, officers, townspeople helping one another, with Emily's smiling face painted softly in the background, almost like an angel watching over them. He stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. One of the young artists noticed him and said shyly, "We wanted her to be part of it. She started all of this, even if she's not here." Mark nodded, struggling to find his voice. "She'd like that," he said softly. Later, as the sun climbed higher, there was a small ceremony. The new sheriff, a woman named Deputy Harris, no relation to the doctor, took the stage. She spoke about community, about second chances, and about what it meant to serve with heart. She spoke with warmth and honesty, qualities Mark had learned to value most. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up slowly, looking out over the crowd. There were so many familiar faces: neighbors, old colleagues, teachers, even the two former deputies who had been dismissed after the investigation. They stood near the back, heads bowed, listening. He cleared his throat and began. "A year ago, I lost someone I loved more than anything in this world. And for a long time, I thought that loss would break me. But what I've learned is that sometimes pain can become a teacher. It forces you to look deeper, to see what you ignored before." He paused, letting the silence settle. "My daughter believed in people. She believed that kindness mattered more than power. I used to think that was just her way of seeing the world, but now I know it's the right way. She changed me, and through her, she changed this town." He looked out at the faces watching him. "We all make mistakes. Some of us carry them for life. But what matters is what we do after, the choices we make to be better. Emily's gone, but her light is still here, in every one of you who chooses compassion over judgment, love over hate." There was a soft wave of applause, but Mark didn't need it. He stepped down quietly, his heart full. After the ceremony, Dr. Harris joined him again. "She'd be proud," the doctor said softly. Mark looked at the sky where the sunlight broke through the clouds. "I hope so," he said. "I think she'd be happy to see all this." As the day went on, he stayed to help clean up, laughing with volunteers and chatting with families. For the first time in a long time, he felt part of the community again, not as the sheriff, but as just another person trying to do good. When the event ended, and the crowd began to thin, he walked toward the edge of the park. There, beneath a tree, was a small stone plaque, one more memorial for Emily. It read, "Her kindness changed us. Her love still guides us." He knelt down beside it, brushing away a few fallen leaves. "We did it, kiddo," he whispered. "You made a difference." A soft wind moved through the trees, and for a brief moment, he could almost hear her laughter again, light and warm like sunshine. That night, he returned home exhausted but peaceful. The stars were bright overhead, and the air smelled like pine and fresh grass. He built a small fire in the fireplace, sat back in his chair, and thought about how far things had come. His old badge still sat in a wooden box on the mantel. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It wasn't just a symbol of his past anymore. It was a reminder of how much he had learned. He whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Emily. The world needs more love, not rules." A single tear slipped down his cheek. But it wasn't from pain. It was from peace. Over the next few months, Mark began volunteering with the foundation, helping with emergency response workshops and mentoring young officers. He found purpose again, not in authority but in service. He became known for his calm wisdom and his ability to listen. One day, a young deputy approached him after a training session. "Sir," she said nervously, "I wanted to thank you. You've taught me more about what it means to wear this badge than anyone else ever has." He smiled gently. "Then remember what I told you. Every person you meet deserves to be treated like someone you care about. If you do that, you'll never go wrong." The deputy nodded with gratitude before walking away. Watching her leave, Mark realized that maybe his story wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. As the seasons passed, the town grew stronger, fairer, kinder. The memory of Emily became something beautiful, a source of hope, not pain. People told stories about her, about how her life had changed their sheriff and in turn changed their whole town. Mark still visited her grave each Sunday, bringing fresh flowers. He didn't say much anymore, just sat in silence, feeling her presence. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, he stood by her grave and whispered, "I'll see you again someday. But until then, I'll keep your light shining." He smiled softly, turned toward his truck and drove away slowly, the road stretching out before him, glowing with the last light of the day. Life had taught him many hard lessons, but in the end, the greatest one was simple. Love is the only thing that truly heals. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he carried that truth with him, knowing that Emily's light would never fade, not from his heart, and not from the town she helped change forever.